Hi everybody, welcome. I'm Susa and I'm going to be the host tonight, and we've got a number of co-hosts as well. So we're just waiting for everybody to get in and get comfy now. Nice to see some familiar faces and lots of new faces, which is wonderful. Um, so I'll just start. So thanks for coming along, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Thanks for coming along to this event, which has been a sort of maybe 3 months in the making. Glasgow Common, be a local group. We've had this as a kind of passion of ours for quite a long time, and what inspired us to do this event.
Sorry, you need to be quick. So we're in a meeting.
What we
Yeah, I noticed.
Okay. We were inspired by John Rogers, who's one of our group members, who wrote an article for UBI and was published on a blog media. And after that, we had contacts from various people who are really passionate about it. And we decided to go and create this meeting. We hope to get a UBI group in Glasgow going forward, where we can kind of, promote this to everybody we know, and also to people who have the powers. We got 3 speakers tonight, speaking about general UBI, speaking about where we are in Scotland and what our options are. And then we have a woman who's going to speak to the benefits for women in terms of equality that UBI might bring. So we'll kick off first of all with Johnny Douglas. Johnny is from the UBI network, and Johnny is one of the founders of the UBI Network Sheffield, which is now kind of escalated into over 30 geographical groups and some non-geographical interest groups such as women, people with disabilities and LGBT people. So without further ado, please take the stage, Johnny.
Thanks very much, Susa. Hi, everyone. Great to see you all here. I know we've still got a few people arriving in the waiting room, but Sam is on that. So I will share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that okay. So to kick things off tonight, I was going to give a sort of a brief overview of the basics of kind of what a basic income is, and also some of our experiences in working within the movement, but also within the UBI Lab network. So, it's not advancing. There we go. So what is a universal basic income? A UBI is a regular and unconditional payment given to everyone, either every week or month throughout the year. Everyone receives it regardless of their income, their wealth, their employment status, their socio-economic position, how much money they have in the bank. Everybody gets the same amount of money. There are additional top-ups to that, and there may be variants for people who are retired and variations for younger children, but that's all part of the system and how it would be fully implemented. And what it does is it basically guarantees a basic level of financial security for everyone, and it makes sure that no one in society can fall through any gaps in a net or for safety net or any cracks, and it supports people who are doing unpaid work such as caring for relatives or being a parent and bringing up children. Obviously, the big question that usually gets asked fairly near to the start of a discussion on basic income is how much would people get? There are lots of different ideas about different amounts, which I'm sure we'll talk lots more about this evening. Some of them for UK proposals range between £50 and £150 a week for adults and £30 to £80 a week for children. In their manifesto in 2019, the Green Party suggested a weekly amount of £89. And we've had different economists suggesting different amounts. Obviously, you'll have probably seen Andrew Yang proposing $1,000 a month. And some of the proposals are higher or lower than these. But one of the key things when we're talking about the amount that something costs is that we're benchmarking and comparing that to the amount of value and the difference it makes to people, which is why it's so important that we for us have a range of amounts, and we're testing things in different ways to see what it is worth investing in people in order to find the best ways to support them. As you might imagine, there is a difference of opinion politically about universal basic income, and that has changed significantly since the start of the pandemic, and support is definitely growing. In our experiences of working on this for the last 4 years or so, we estimate we've probably come 5 or 6 years worth of campaigning in the last 9 or 10 months. So although none of us would have obviously wished the circumstances in which we find ourselves in, there have been some slight benefits to it in the fact that it has accelerated a number of different changes that would probably have taken much less time previously. So the Green Party have supported the initiative since the 70s and had it as a central policy in their 2019 election campaign. The Liberal Democrats have now come out in support of it, which we were involved in helping them bring that to the fray. The SNP obviously have commissioned the report looking at how easy it would be to trial UBI in Scotland, which Mike will talk much more about. And we had hundreds of MPs in the Labour Party calling for it, an emergency basic income at the start of the pandemic. It made it into their initial manifesto or pretty close to it for the most recent general election. I know we've had quite a few in recent years. And we've had Plaid Cymru leader Adam Price has come out in significant favour of trialling and looking at this, as well as the Alliance Party. Conservatives, as you might imagine, aren't necessarily fully on board with this yet, because they have different systems which they think better benefit people in other ways. But we'll all work on that. Why is the time for basic income become so apparent now? We need no reminder of the main reason. We're all living and experiencing it at the moment, and it has accelerated a number of different factors, and it's also highlighted a lot of the issues with the current system we have. And I think regardless of our opinion or political persuasion, I think we can all definitely agree that this isn't the best that we can do. We can definitely help and support people better. We can find ways to improve society, and we think that a UBI would be a really great way of doing that. There may be other ways in which we could support that as well, but we're just focused on trying it now, because what we need to ensure and learn from this pandemic first and foremost is that no one is ever in the position that they're in again. And millions of people across the country have obviously experienced something that a lot of people that would otherwise they just wouldn't have an understanding of. And the reality is that the kind of panic and uncertainty that so many of us have felt over the last 9 or 10 months is actually the reality of lots of people in all sorts of situations, both in Scotland, across the rest of the UK, all day, every day. That is the life they have to live. And that is definitely something that we need to address as an allegedly developed and modern society. I also wanted to mention, obviously, the situation that a lot of young people are in now, and our education system, which is in itself a universal system that is available to everyone, just like the NHS is at its point of use, and that we provide that education because we want to give everyone a good chance, and we want to create the conditions where they have at least the opportunity to strive and find ways to be better. And that really is a really great comparison when we're looking at what is a universal basic income for. Well, it levels up and it redistributes something that you hopefully can have access to regardless of basically the postcode genetic lottery of where you were born and what situation you are born into. We want to find a way to change that. There are a number of different organisations working in this area. It's not a new idea, as I mentioned, and they've been doing that for some time. So we've got the Citizens Basic Income Trust that's been going for a significant amount of time now. BN, which is the Basic Income Earth Network, which was started a couple of years later. They've got 37 national and area-based affiliates with about, I think about 4, I can't remember the numbers, but yeah, they've got a number of different initiatives going on across the whole of Europe, and we work with them. There's Basic Income Europe, which is a non-for-profit registered in Belgium, which has around 400 active members in 27 different countries. And that also inspired the creation of Basic Income UK, which is another campaigning organisation that works in the UK. The more recent people, in comparison to the kind of 35, 36 year historic old timers, is Basic Income Network Scotland, which Mike's going to talk to you a bit more about. World Basic Income, which was actually founded in Manchester and now has an international advisory board and works on a lot of different pilots. ourselves, which we started in 2016 in Sheffield. And as Susan said, we now have 38 different labs across the country and 5 internationally. And then there's also the Basic Income Conversation, which was started by the London-based think tank Compass. We really want to try all sorts of different types of basic income, as I say, to attribute value to what a basic income could be and the difference it might make to people. And the thing that ties all of those things together and underpins that is actually a value set. So we think it's really, really important that the right sort of basic income is tested and looked at in terms of an impact. We want to ensure that that basic income is equal, simple, democratic and inclusive to ensure that it wouldn't leave anyone worse off than they currently are in any situation that they find themselves in the current welfare system. We've got a number of different labs based in the UK. So 33 of our 38 labs are based in the UK. 28 of those are geographically based in towns, cities and regions across the country. We wanted to create a platform so that people could figure out what really matters to them about universal basic income. So rather than emphasizing the kind of macro concept of basic income and talking to people about that, we think it's really important that we break through the kind of traditional campaigning and advocacy mechanisms to find out what matters to people and how it might impact and change them. Because we believe that the only way to change the world is one person at a time. And over the last 9 or 10 months, as we've accelerated in the number of labs we've formed, naturally, organically, not by the kind of core supporting team, which is myself, Jiwei, Sam and James, who work for a For Impact organisation in Sheffield called Opus Independence, which is, I guess you would describe as a think and do tank, is that some of the people within the network came to us and said, we think it's really important that young people have a voice in this. We think it's really important that women have a voice in this. And we started to form non-geographic labs. So these, although based in the UK, are around communities of people looking at how a basic income might affect people within those communities and with those lived experiences. So Chiwe is going to talk to you more about the women's lab, but we also have an arts lab, an LGBTQ+ lab and a disability lab, looking at papers and pilots around the UBI plus model, because obviously certain people have certain needs that require extra input and extra amounts so that, again, they don't end up worse off than they might find themselves in the current welfare system. We're always looking to engage people and get beyond our bubble. So we do a number of different events, and we think it's really important to engage with things like this and get more and more people talking about basic income, because although lots of people have heard of a basic income or are starting to hear of basic income as the Overton window shifts, it's still a fairly unknown concept. We share resources with each other. We've been responsible, involved in or supported around 80% of the now 25+ council motions that have come across the UK calling on the government to implement a basic income and test it. We've also formed a CPPLG, bringing together politicians and elected representatives who wrote to the Chancellor Rishi Sunak, 520 of them calling on him to trial a basic income. And one of our current projects, which is one of many which we can talk more about in Q&A, is we're getting mayors to pledge their support. So the number of mayoral campaigns happening at the moment in the UK, and we currently have around 12 candidates who have pledged their support. That is my brief overview of basic income and the UBI Lab Network. Thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for kicking us off, Johnny. That was great. Before I introduce our next speaker, who's Mike, there's just a few sort of admin things that I omitted to share at the beginning, so I apologise for that. Just to let you know that everybody is on mute because somebody was saying they had no voice. We do that until you wish to speak, just so that we kind of make sure there's no background noise. So if you want to speak or ask a question, we will unmute you at that point. One of the things that people might want to do is to add where they're from, whether that's geographically or if they've got, you know, a special group that they're a part of to their name. It would be nice to see who we have with us tonight. In terms of the question and answer session to the panel, if folks have burning questions, you may type your question into the chat forum right now, and that will filter through to us once the speakers have finished. If you want to ask the question yourself, please just type your name and we'll come to you that way. Or if you're not comfortable using chat, please just raise your hand, and we've got a couple of checkers here who will note your name and will let me know that you want to ask a question. If you do ask a question, please keep it as brief as you can, because as you can see, we've got a lot of people here and a lot to get through. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mike Danson, Professor Mike Danson, who heads up what was called the Citizens Basic Income Network Scotland and is now known as the Basic Income Network Scotland. Mike, I'm going to just let you introduce yourself because the technology has failed me in terms of the introduction piece I had. So Mike, please take the stage.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Yeah, as I just said, I'm chair of Basic Income Network Scotland. We're an organisation that has evolved over the years. So Johnny just mentioned CBIC, Citizens Basic Income Trust, and BN, the Basic Income Earth Network. The founders of Basic Income Network Scotland were also involved in those UK and worldwide organisations. So we've been going a long time in Scotland. The founder members were meeting through the early 2000s, at least before 2010. People like Annie Miller, who closed the last BN Congress, Jamie Cook, the Royal Society of Arts, Jamie's on the executive committee and so on. So Scotland's really been at the very core of the development of basic income ideas, the concept, education, advocacy for basic income. And that's important, that heritage, that legacy, because it's well embedded into Scotland, and I'll touch upon that later. To the extent that various people's panels, poverty commissions and so on were really behind the moves within Scotland to establish the feasibility study we'll come on to. Also, that heritage is recognising that we have the global Congress coming here in August to Glasgow. It'll be the first virtual Congress ever, and we're delighted to say it'll be the first free Congress, so that people from around the world will be able to attend the biggest basic income conference in the world. I'm just going to run through a number of slides just to put this in. So I'm just going to try and reduce the size of the photos on this side. Okay, as I said, across a number of local authority areas in the 2015 and such, there was a growing demand that we address poverty, the dire levels of poverty we have in Scotland and across the UK. In particular, Glasgow itself, Edinburgh, North Ayrshire and Fife, local people were demanding through citizens' assemblies, poverty commissions, people's panels, that we at least explore whether basic income could help to address poverty. The Scottish Parliament Social Security Committee picked this up and asked for evidence from the likes of Jamie Cook, Annie Miller and so on around those three questions. What level be sufficient? How would we fund it? And could it work given our devolved powers? We, with the parliamentarians, established a cross-party group in the Scottish Parliament a few years ago. And all of that persuaded the Scottish Government this was an idea worth exploring. So they funded a feasibility study. And that was driven by those four councils, the NHS, because health is a poverty issue and vice versa, the Improvement Service, who are there to improve the delivery of services in Scotland, public services. So those councils, NHS, Improvement Services, the government, the Parliament, all agreed to fund this feasibility study. The feasibility study delivered its final report in June 2020, and that's been the Scottish Government since then considering it. There's a link there to where you can find the final report. and get back to me, anybody who wants to see it. This has been welcomed around the world as a really sober, robust, rigorous set of evidence. They've, not literally, but they've been around the world, they've gathered evidence from academics, from policymakers, from previous studies and pilots and experiments and so on. This very long report, the executive summary is nice and short, was complemented by a big economic modelling exercise as well. That's almost 200 words. It's quite accessible, but obviously it's quite long. And again, it underpins the rigour with which we're addressing this within Scotland. Feasibility study was to be considered in 4 ways. Firstly, if we think back to the Ottawa experiment, change of government, and they just withdrew the idea of a basic income overnight. And that was real problematic because a lot of the effects of a basic income will only come through over time. And therefore, you want an experiment or a pilot to last quite a number of years so you can explore and examine what impacts it's having. Had to be institutionally feasible. That didn't only mean things like, could the banks handle basic income to actually get the money, the payment to individuals? Not as easy as it sounds, but also with the public institutions, the DWP, HMRC and others, local authorities, health boards, could they handle a basic income? Would they cooperate and agree with it? That becomes a critical one. Psychologically, would they support even a small pilot basic income scheme to see how it worked? And behaviour. Always in this sort of presentation, these sort of events, people say, how would we afford it? And what would stop people just lying on the couch, watching the telly, becoming obese? What behavioural changes might we expect, positive and negative, from a basic income? So the proposed model, as Johnny said, says basic characteristics of a basic income. It's the regular payment, so it's every week or month, and you get it in some form, usually a bank transfer. It's to the individual, not the family. Cheba, we'll talk about this in a minute. It goes to every adult in Scotland or in a pilot area or the UK or whatever. There will be payments for children under the age of 16, and that will go to the parent, the guardian, usually the mother. And for those without capacity, disabilities and so forth, then it would go to the guardian. For a pilot, it will go to everybody in the saturation site, regardless of their income, age, individual characteristics. And the critical one for many, it's unconditional and can't be withdrawn. It's a right. The pilots that were proposed for Scotland come at 2 levels. Firstly, related to the minimum income standards. Now, these have been worked out in various contexts, the European Union, bodies across the UK who will do work on poverty. And it was suggested that for some of the people in one of the pilot areas, they would receive this higher rate, which they look, in inverted commas, generous. And higher than the sorts of ones Johnny was talking about. There would also be lower level. The lower level will be related to the existing social security benefits. And why at that level? Well, to see what impact it would have on people of withdrawing the threat of sanctions, taking away the means testing, having to prove that you should be entitled to a benefit and so on. So these 2 levels of basic income payments under the pilots that were proposed to see and to gauge the different effects and so on. The existing means tested benefits and the like would be withdrawn for the period the pilot, income support, job seekers allowance, universal credit and so on. So we get rid of them. Instead, people on those benefits or going on to those benefits instead would receive the basic income along with everybody else, regardless of their income. Certain other social security benefits would continue to defray unavoidable costs. So disability benefits would continue, as now. People with life-limiting conditions entitled to benefits over and above, those will continue. Because housing costs vary across the country, between cities and rural, small towns and so on, housing benefits would continue as well. And the passported benefits, clearly also important. So the pilot, there'll be another year of preparation once it was agreed by the Scottish Government. It would then be run for 3 years with assessment and evaluation going on at the time and at the end to see whether this should be rolled out much further. Everyone would receive it in the pilot areas. Inflation would be built in, so you get uplifts each year, and how it interacted with the tax system would also be important. In effect, it would replace the income tax, the personal allowance. The detail on that screen doesn't matter. What's important about the screen is the amount of depth and the degrees of looking at indicators of change over short, medium and longer term periods were built into how a basic income pilot in Scotland or pilots would be evaluated. And again, that's been praised because it's much deeper and broader than some of the other pilots and experiments we've seen around the world. Just last week, we had the Citizens' Assembly of Scotland, which is randomly chosen people looking at a whole series of issues. And they came out, just recognise that these photos are in the wrong place. They came out and said, looking at what sort of Scotland we had, more than two-thirds of the people said everybody should have a universal basic income. See, going back to saying we've won the arguments in Scotland. People in Scotland overwhelmingly accepting the idea of a basic income, at least a pilot, if not more. And the more we educate and advocate, the higher that proportion of people goes. So why haven't we introduced it? If it's so great? Well, because the UK government departments are absolutely and utterly critical. Scotland has more powers than the Welsh Senate or the Northern Ireland Assembly. And they've also been talking about base income. All three of the devolved governments have far more powers than any city in England. Scotland can't run these pilots because the Westminster government will not agree. They will not cooperate. They won't even talk to the Scottish government, nor those who are doing the feasibility study, about how a pilot might be worked, introduced, and it's absolutely critical for a whole series of ethical reasons, because you'll be taxed at a much higher rate if they ignore the basic income element and how it interacts. DWP could sanction people, sanction them if they moved house outside of a pilot area, or moved, at the end of the pilot, if they then tried to sign on or get universal credit, they'd be sanctioned because they hadn't been looking for work in some cases, because they didn't have to, because they were on a base income, which is non-withdrawable and so on. So for Scotland, a basic income can only be introduced if the UK government, if the Westminster government and departments agree to it, to cooperate closely, or if we have independence. So there are important lessons not only for Scotland taking it forward in basic income, but also for the cities in England and the Welsh Senate and the Northern Ireland Assembly, because critical for us to take this any further, even though the Scottish government have said they agree with the basic income, even though the Scottish Greens have said that, and various other politicians from Labour and Lib Dems and such, even though we've got this huge majority in favour of it, nothing can happen until the UK government agrees that they will cooperate on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much for that. We now have our third and final speaker tonight, and that is Chiwi from UBI Labs. Chiwi is a specialist in international things and also in gender and UBI. Chiwi, please take the floor and introduce yourself further as you may wish. Thank you.
Good evening. Thanks so much for having me. I'll just get my slides on. A second. There we go. Thank you. Sorry for that. So my name is Chiwe Chihana, and I work for the UBI Lab Network, and I'm also a co-founder of the UBI Lab Women. So I'll be talking to you about why women, why the UBI Lab Network. Then we'll talk a bit about the inequalities and women's financial insecurity. And then we'll go on to talk about the precarious state of unemployment, employment itself, unpaid work. And I hope I'll talk to you about evidence from micropilots for women that we think are worth highlighting in the call for a UBI for women. And then we'll also talk about a call to action by the UBI Lab Women. So the key basis for UBI Lab Women is recognizing that women's poverty is gendered, and that women are currently more likely to live in extreme poverty compared to men. The implications of that are far-ranging. And we think that a UBI would formally recognize and reward socially valuable labor that people currently perform outside of the paid economy, such as caregiving for children, disabled people, elderly relatives, etc. What we want as the UBI Lab as UBI Lab Women is to see economic justice for women as a whole. And we want to see that a UBI is tested at the very least. And we also want to get more sensitization around the benefits of a UBI from some pilots that we've seen, and hope that it could influence piloting within the UK. So there are lots of economic burdens that are related to caregiving, jobs that pay women less than men, jobs that pay less than male-dominated industries. We know that a basic income can be transformative for women, their families, and their larger communities. So we think that once a UBI is given to women, it can accord them the freedom to leave abusive relationships, and where they've been forced to stay on because they're tied to their financial security, to their abuser, they would be free to leave if they had a basic income. And this also applies both to a work situation as well as a home situation. In a work environment, a basic income would make the decision to work more voluntarily easier for women. Women would no longer choose to remain in toxic jobs solely because they can't afford not to leave. In this way, a UBI could address gender-based mistreatment in the workplaces. So by freeing women of their economic dependence on employers, a UBI would also improve women's bargaining positions, and it would enable them to negotiate for more flexible hours or better conditions. There's also the matter of childcare. Childcare is extraordinarily expensive, and women, especially single moms, end up shouldering an enormous burden for this cost. So parents who would actually prefer to leave, who would prefer to work, do not get to have that chance to decide because they cannot afford to offer their children quality childcare. And so they'll more than likely choose to leave the workforce for this reason than men would. And because a UBI would be paid to individuals rather than to households, it means that a UBI that's paid to mothers as well as their children would be able to help pay for quality childcare costs. Then further to that, the benefit system is precarious, it's stigmatizing, and it's complicated, and it discourages a lot of women from accessing their benefits. And in most cases as well, because it's means tested, some do not qualify. We see a universal basic income being the antithesis to that, to all those challenges, because it's paid unconditionally. You don't have to go through hoops in order to receive it. And with all that, of course, there are so many more reasons. With all that, what you see is that women's mental well-being as well improves as a result of a universal basic income. So there have been a few micro pilots that have taken place in some places. So I'll give you one from a developing country, and then maybe two or one from developed nations. So in India, there was a micro pilot that took place in a community that was led by by SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association. They set up 2 basic income experiments in 2 different parts of India. And the findings in summary were that families started to give their daughters the same amount of food as their sons. The women felt freer to participate in village activities. Women from rich families who had turned their noses up at a UBI, they came forward and to have their own money after 2 months. And women who were involved in the informal economic activities within their families started to finally call their trade work. Then there was also a shift in terms of empowerment for their own communities, because the women were earning more and they were reinvesting into the small trade that they were doing. In the United States, there was a pilot by the Magnolia Mothers Trust. It was with African-American women and single African-American mothers, actually, who lived in the projects. I believe this is Mississippi. And in their case, what was found was that the women who were part of this pilot improved themselves financially. They got into businesses, but then there were also further impacts, such as their children going to school more frequently. Performance at school was better for their children, and the women were empowered, mental well-being was better, and some of them actually moved out of the projects and were able to move into preferred neighborhoods in the case of the United States. There was also another example in Canada as well, which would be probably similar to a UK scenario. In Canada, during the micropilot in the 1970s, there was a drop in hospital attendance for domestic abuse when women were given a basic income. So we see a lot of opportunity for a basic income to empower women, to help end poverty, for economic justice for women. And we also understand that when women are empowered financially, then definitely a community is empowered. And as such, the UBI Lab Network, as a bare minimum here in the United Kingdom, we are looking to, we will look, as a bare minimum, would like to see that a UBI is tested. Would like to see the conversation on UBI and what it could potentially do for women become more mainstream in the UBI movement itself. And we're also under no illusion that until everybody has equal access to money and the ability to freely make their life choices without financial or other cohesion, there will be no gender equality. And so it is important that women have access to money. Thanks a lot.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Chiwi. That was really important and informative. We're going to throw the floor open now for anybody that wants to ask questions. You can ask question of the whole panel, or you can direct your question to a specific participant if you require to do so. Please type your question into the chat if you want us to read the question for you. If you want to say the question yourself, please just type in your name in capital letters. Or if you want to wave your hand, our lovely co-host will check and will let us know that you want to ask a question. So, any takers? I've got some general questions, but if anybody has a burning question right now, please do. I'll give you a couple of minutes to put that into the chat, because I know that can take quite a while.
There's one from Wendy in the chat already, who says, is there any evidence that introduction of UBI has unintended adverse effects, such as landlords raising rents?
Good question, Wendy. I'll just try and find you so I can unmute you. Wendy, if you got your... Wendy Haynes, I'm just going to unmute you. Oops, lost you, Wendy. Right, Wendy. Sorry.
Do you want me to start on that, and then while you find Wendy, she can respond if she wants to?
Sure, thank you.
So I would suggest, obviously, there are lots of potential risks of unintended consequences, and I personally wouldn't consider a basic income any sort of silver bullet or a panacea that's going to fix all of our problems instantly just by giving people money. But hopefully, there are lots of other protections within our society and our laws that would help prevent those things happening. And also, hopefully, if lots of people have the means to be more aware of what is happening to them, or what is being changed in society and what they might be subjected to, because they're not living from day to day panicking whether they can afford to put the heating on or food on the table, they will be able to more actively engage not only with the situation that is affecting them, their family and their community, but potentially get more involved in campaigning for creating better systems within society on all sorts of different levels. And I think that can be true with the massive issue that we have, which is the housing crisis, because housing has been turned into a commodity, and it's not even really valued in terms of housing and bricks and mortar anymore. It's valued as numbers on a spreadsheet, which are traded in all sorts of different ways and used to exploit people. So we've fundamentally broken the relationship between a tenant and a landlord to the extent where it's just money to be an investment amounts to be traded. So there's lots of things that we need to look at for that. But I don't think it's UBI's job to focus on that. I think there is a lot of interesting things for us to explore in terms of the disparity in the cost of housing from all different corners of our Fair Isles that definitely needs looking at. But hopefully people having a UBI would allow them to engage more in those conversations.
Okay, I just add in that Basic Income Network Scotland, along with others, held a whole series of workshops a couple of years ago, which you can find on our website. The report, one area we looked at was housing. The conclusion there, working with people who experience homelessness, shelter, housing professionals, and so on, was that, as Johnny's just said, UBI is not a solution to housing issues. More houses is, controlling landlords and rents. Following that up, we've got a podcast with the producers at the moment about to be put out there, particularly on UBI and housing. We saw it as an extremely important issue for the reasons Johnny's just said. So complementing UBI would need to be strengthening of controls over landlords, rent controls, more housing, particularly more social and affordable housing. The other big issue we ran into there, raised, was around disability and so on. And I've put a long invitation in the chat to the second set of workshops we're having at the moment, inviting anybody and everybody along, and that's on mental health and UBI. Thank you.
I've had a direct question from Sheena. Sheena, I'm going to answer your question. So you're asking about the the pilots that I cited. You ask if they were so successful, why weren't they permanently implemented? So with the piloting, these are philanthropic pilots, all of them, and in order to permanently implement a universal basic income, I believe in the States at least, and Canada, I'm not very sure about India and how the welfare system works, but you would still need to go through government channels. It would be an act of parliament at the very least. I think that would get that implemented. So that's why. However, I can tell you that the one in the United States has been scaling up. So it started off with 50 women in the program, and then they went into the second year and increased it to around 120. So now they're going into the third phase because the benefits have just been so good, and there's been lots of goodwill into inputting more money into that particular pilot. I hope that that's what you were asking for, Sheena.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that, Chiwi. The next question we're going to take is from Luca Notini. Luca's written in the chat, what about universal basic services instead of universal basic income? I suppose it's fair to say that we're a little bit ahead of the rest of the UK here in Scotland on that. So I don't know if Mike, you want to lead off to reply with that?
Sure, and again, this is an issue that's often raised for people with particular political persuasions and such. We don't see them as being incompatible. We don't see them as being in conflict with each other. Most of the universal basic services that we have already wouldn't disappear. They're consistent and supportive, complement universal basic income. So things like the National Health Service, even things like defence and so on, these are universal. They're basic services. They cover everybody equally. Sometimes you see it as a cop-out. It's a way to circumvent the idea of the basic income. As I said, we see them as complementary. They could come in. Just to pick up, for going homeless and UBI asked, yeah, that was one of the tricky questions, is how can we get money to everybody in society? It's universal. So addressing that for the homeless people in particular is an issue. It's solvable and so forth. Johnny, don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I'm happy to add to that. I think with all of these things, what we're looking to do is to test, to understand better, because it's very, very easy to have an opinion on these things, but what we really need to do is find out. As Mike said, they're not mutually exclusive, UBS and UBI. They definitely need looking into, and they can exist in society as they already do. The question for me is how do you judge what is kind of a universal basic service to people and what is important to one person or another? So we have a lab down in London. Is a universal basic service down there access to the tube? What if a tube doesn't go where you want to go? Is it access to a bus? Do you get a bus pass? Does that take you where you want to go? If you live in a rural area, do you have a bus service that supports you in a way that a bus pass would be useful? Or do you use your bike and therefore you don't have access to those, you don't need to access those services, therefore you don't benefit from them? And I think it just can get quite complicated quite quickly. And for me, the beauty of the simplicity of a basic income is that the reason we have money is because it's exchangeable for pretty much everything. And it fundamentally changes the relationship between citizen and state, because you're basically saying, as a government or as a state, we trust you to make the decisions that are right for you. And for me, universal basic income is just a way of simplifying universal basic services. I think there's an interesting conversation to have around who should own those services and whether they should be publicly owned or not. But obviously that's a completely separate conversation that we won't delve into the rabbit hole of tonight.
Great, thank you for that, Johnny. Colette Walker, who asked a question about homeless people in UBI. Do you want to come back on that, Colette, or do you want to say anything more about your question about homeless people?
I think it was covered there a wee minute ago, but I'm just, obviously it's a universal income. So really the most vulnerable people in society are the ones that are going to benefit from this the most. And I think obviously as a disabled woman, then I'm interested in disability and carers. But I think homeless in society, our homeless population is increasing. And I think really we need to look at a way of getting them involved in UBI. Would they be eligible if they don't have a fixed abode? How do they access information? How do they access the money? Because then it could really bring them back into society. It could give them a purpose to life. It could give them accommodation. It could get them into some type of employment. It could actually change the life of a homeless person quite considerably. So I think a real focus has to be put on homelessness.
Thanks for that. Colette, any of the panel want to respond before we move on?
No, just agree with that. In those meetings we had with shelter, housing associations, with representatives and homeless people, yeah, would fully support what you've just said. Also, just a side issue, an awful lot of the homeless are ex-forces. And ironically, I think from talking to people who've been in the force at a senior level, most of them are actually due a war pension because they've been disabled out of the forces. So we're failing them as a society as a whole anyway. But we know that addressing many of their issues, one with income and two with a home, shelter, would make a big difference to their lives. And they would have the security to be able to rebuild with help from others. Yeah. It's a good question, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike.
Chiwe, did you want to say something? Or?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. So with regards to, I think Colette, you just talked about how would they be paid if they're homeless, and so that's still something that people, researchers are looking into, but we have seen a system in a place like Kenya where a pilot was also done not too long ago, and people were paid using mobile phones. So there could be that's an option. Another option that's been talked about is people just being given a card that's paid in a cash card that's already paid, that's already got cash on it. So those are just some of the few things that people are looking at, but there are different options that are being considered as far as we know in that way.
And just to add to that as well, as very much agreeing with what you've said and what both Mike and Chiwe have said, is as we look into the mid and longer term, this is hopefully one of the things that we can start to maybe reimagine some of the systems in which we depend on, and some of those government institutions that currently have lots of people that find themselves in a similar position to lots of people working in the medical services and the NHS, where they become inert and have to remove themselves from the situation because even being on the other side of the table, it's really, really hard working with people that have complex issues and other situations. And we might be able to shift some of those institutions to become supporting institutions that are there to help people, which will actually fundamentally not only change the kind of stigma of asking for help, but actually shift over time our society and cultural perception about wanting to help and support each other, which could have some really, really far-reaching positive consequences, I think.
Maybe something we should have stressed, and Chiwe has just mentioned, is it's cash that people will be getting, not vouchers, not tokens, not food, etc. direct. It's trusting them, it's giving them back responsibility. And we actually know this has a big impact on people's lives, and you can trust You can trust the poor far more than the rich to make the best decisions for themselves.
Yeah, I think there was a recent micropilot in the US where they'd specifically targeted it at people that found themselves in a homelessness position. And I think after a 12-month study, it was like 60 or 70% of them still had more than 50% of the money that they were given left. They hadn't squandered it, they hadn't wasted it, they'd actually kept hold of it as a security mechanism to change their situation.
Great, thanks, Johnny. We're going to move on. We have Sean C, who has asked to put a question in the chat. So, Sean, if you can ask your question, please.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the establishment of Social Security Scotland makes UBI in Scotland more feasible, or at least the plus part of UBI plus, because it's completely separate from the DWP. So if we were looking to establish a UBI here, even just a trial, maybe Social Security Scotland would have a part to play in that.
If I could start on that, it would give some expertise and some administration that would be necessary for a full pilot or a full basic income. However, DWP would still control the big majority of their benefits, their social security payments. And if you think somebody's on universal credit and do other things from Scottish social security, universal credit will be stopped because here they are getting money. The idea of basic income, it's unconditional. It can't be withdrawn. You don't have to show you're out there looking for a job umpteen times a day and so forth. So good question. It's building capacity, civil service capacity. It's more like the sort of agency Johnny was hoping we'd be able to start to create with the individuals and the people within it, but it doesn't really help overcome the major barriers of DWP, HMRC and such not cooperating.
Thank you. Next question, John Murray. If you want to ask your question, I think it was your earlier question prior to your comment.
I think, yeah, there was, let me just go back up to, I posted on the chat. Can't seem to see it now. I thought it was going to be answered during the presentations, but kind of as an example, I think Johnny mentioned maximum £150 UBI figure. Quick calculation on that, say for 4 million people over 18s, roughly around about 38 billion a year, roughly 18% of GDP. How can that be sold to the voters? How can that be sold to people who are going to vote for these things? And does anything need to be sacrificed to make it work?
I suppose, yeah, the headline figure that often gets quoted is the gross cost, but because this UBI is a way of redistributing money, and as you'll see in a lot of the modelling, it's usually used in terms of income tax. So it would be actively distributed to people at the lower ends of the socioeconomic scale, and as you go further and further up, you would gradually become a net contributor to that system. We've also looked in different bits of pilot proposals and papers that we've done. We've identified probably about 12 different ways to pay for a UBI. And that's why when I was mentioning about the importance of working out the value, the impact and the difference it makes to people in society first is so important. Because then when we're comparing that figure, whether it is 18% of GDP or as other studies have been done, I think Open Democracy launched a paper where the cost was about 67 billion when you factored in all of the ingoings and outgoings. So 67 billion is only about 10% or maybe a little bit less of GDP. And as a cost in inverted commas for potentially having a massive impact on eliminating poverty, that's a pretty cheap price to pay. And the knock-on effect going forward, as we hopefully see this over time, is the kind of the benefits to the lessening impact on the NHS and other support systems that are probably much harder to calculate. But the important thing is that we focus on the net cost. So people would effectively become net contributors. And it's often one of the things that's thrown at it in terms of, well, why would millionaires get it? Well, the same way that if you crash a Fiesta or a Ferrari on the motorway, the emergency services turn up and they help you and they take you to a hospital and make sure you get the support you need. It's there for everyone. And hopefully with the proper adjustments to the tax system and other systems, people would be contributing the fair amounts they should do.
Yeah, and just to supplement that, closing an awful lot of tax loopholes cost the exchequer a huge amount of money. And just thinking over the last year of COVID, which has made a lot of people start reappraising what they do, what they spend their money on, and so forth. So I think it's a wee wedge of making people rethink an awful lot of other aspects of the economy and society. So on the other side of that, how have we been able to afford the pandemic, huge numbers furloughed and so on, by creating money? And I'm an economist, I won't go into all the details, but basically we've been borrowing from ourselves. We've created money, that's paid for that. The economy hasn't collapsed, it's down 7% on a year ago. That's not a huge amount. And UBI is well within those sorts of figures. And then there's a number of innovative ways of raising funds, which we haven't done before. Land value tax has been put in there, modern monetary theory and the like. So again, if it's opening up debates and innovative ways of thinking, then it's another benefit of the examination, the consideration of basic income as a way to change society.
Thanks. Chiwe, do you want to come in? Oh, Chiwe, you're mute.
Apologies for that. I think I was just going to, I think more or less repeat what Mike had said about how we've been able to bail out the banks even before in 2008. So it's a bit cliche to use that, but yes, it's doable. And also regarding the economy, the local economy question, I don't know whether Mike tapped into that a little bit, but that money that what's paid definitely gets paid back into the economy because people have spending power on the most basic level of answering that economic question.
Great, thanks, Chiwe. Wendy, sorry, I beg your pardon, Leslie Watson, you put a question in the chat a while ago. Leslie, do you want to speak your question? If Leslie, I can read Leslie's question aloud, and Leslie, if you want to come in afterwards, you're welcome to do so. So Leslie said, the link between UBI and the tax system, and how would you utilise this to give a reasonable benefit of UBI, and what might the implications be? Mike?
Yeah, I saw that question. I wasn't quite sure. I think it's talking about the interaction between a basic income and the tax system. For those around about, basically those who are in employment on low wages at the moment, is what I think some of the biggest impacts would be, because it would empower those workers. I think Chiwe might want to pick up on this. Those sort of workers who are the ones who've been often essential workers during the current period. They're often on short-term contracts, the precariat, as Guy Standing and others have described them. They would be empowered to be able to, at the moment, stay at home, not go out, being infected and affecting other people with COVID. They'd also be able to say, I'm not going to take a job at a poverty wage. I can have a think. I can look around for something better. And so individually and collectively, their bargaining power would be raised. So in many ways, those around about the personal allowance or just below it, who are in employment, who are struggling, would be most benefited by a basic income. Those at the top end, very high salaries, they would be adversely affected. There is a turnover point where the basic income you're getting isn't enough to offset the extra taxes you're paying. Most of these studies over time have suggested that that doesn't affect labour market participation, i.e. people working, the effort they put in, the number of hours. What it might do again is to empower and make some people think, actually, why am I doing all these extra hours? So again, the last year, COVID has made those who are able to reevaluate their work-life balance. So the tax system and a basic income would interact in ways, as Johnny said earlier, we need to explore and examine through pilots and experiments.
Okay, thank you, Mike. We're just going to skip on to the next question now, because as you said, Johnny's already talked about tax interaction. So the next person is Sandy Carmichael. Sandy, do you want to ask a question, or would you like me to read it because you've already put it in the chat?
Well, yes, it's in the area of implementation and piloting and so on. What I was wondering about was how feasible it would be to introduce tomorrow a universal basic income for children up to 16, as was mentioned earlier, and for those of pension age. This would simplify the introduction when we got round to it for the working age, or higher education and working age, 17s to 65s, let's say, if only in terms of the scale of numbers being brought into a universal basic income. At the same time, it would certainly virtually eliminate child poverty and pensioner poverty, where the universal basic income was set at at the reasonable living income. And perhaps introducing for those two bracket age groups, as it were, wouldn't significantly distort the working age economy, which seems to be the major concern of universal basic income introduction for taxation and the like. So do you think that's a feasible way into universal basic income?
Mike. Johnny? Mike? Sorry, Mike.
I'm happy to respond initially. I mean, in terms of the implementation and the practicalities of doing that, systems that are already considered in that kind of area are probably a lot easier to transition. With all of this, the trick is really about how we get from where we are to where we want to be. It's not easy. It's not very hard to imagine what it might be like if everybody had it and the systems were set up to do it. How we get from where we are now to there is definitely tricky, but all things potentially worth doing are. So I think there would definitely need to be a phased approach, and segregating into systems which already exist would definitely make that transition a lot easier.
Jamie, did you have anything?
Actually, my computer froze, so I didn't hear most of what was asked in that one.
Okay, if I pick up, it's about whether we should introduce it for children and those on statutory pension. Would that be a step in the right direction?
Yeah.
I think it definitely would be a step in the right direction. The problem, I think, would still be systems in terms of it being introduced immediately. Of course, that would be an ideal situation, and it would definitely inform what the wider rollout would look like. But I'm afraid there would be hurdles, I think, in terms of systems right now to do that immediately.
Well, thanks. What we could also say is that for much of the post-war period, we had a basic income for children. We had family allowance, which became child benefit and so on, until the Thatcher government changed it markedly. So it hasn't been a problem in the past. There were educational maintenance allowances for children of poorer families to stay on in education post-16. And the statutory retirement pension, whatever it's now called, they keep changing it, is meant to be a basic income for pensioners. Some of these things are now means tested and so forth, so it doesn't have all the elements of basic income. But there is the basic information and systems there that maybe not immediately, but they could be introduced. But how they interact with other benefits. We would want to avoid cliff edges. So once you reach 16, if your basic income for the child stopped, there'll be pressure to leave school and not continue. So we'd want to, some people have discussed your very idea, and some have suggested it, we bring it in and then we just increase it every year so that those who are 15 at the moment would continue to get it next year and the next year and so on, to gradually pushed up through the age groups incrementally. But unintended consequences are often a problem in economics. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you for that, Mike. Next question from Susan, please. We have two Susans, I think, in the room, and we're not sure who posted the question. So Susan, who asked to ask a question, if you can ask it, please.
Hi. Basically, there are 4 pilots planned in Scotland for UBI. And that happened in June 2020. So the Scottish Government agreed to the 4 pilots, but what has happened is, having agreed to the 4 pilots, they then discovered that the methodology they were using for the pilots was quite strange. They wanted to have a control group who got a smaller amount. So one group of people would get a smaller amount and one group of people would get much more. And they were going to run it in Glasgow, Fife and Edinburgh. Pick out the deprived 4 areas and then run this parallel groups and see what happened for a year. So the government gave $250,000 for that project. But because it was quite a controversial way to study it, it was agreed that it would go back to the councils. I know the Greens in Edinburgh have had motions through asking for pilots on UBI. So obviously it got eaten by COVID. So the plan is now that those councils that are affected have to go back and debate whether or not they run a pilot. And the interesting thing is, in the Fife Council, the Tories are supporting it. So it genuinely seems to have cross-party support. So there is a plan to run this pilot. It just needs each council to pass it at council level. That's it.
Thanks for that, Susan. That's really interesting, because one of the things that we are actually hoping to get out of this meeting is to form a local sort of UBI promotion and pressure group, certainly in Glasgow to start with. We've kind of penciled in a meeting for the 17th of February, which is 3 weeks today, if folk want to make a note of that in their diary. And we will be looking at what kind of elected officials and local authorities that we do need to put pressure on, as well as obviously, spreading the idea around. So panelists, do you want to respond to Susan too?
Yeah, I think, as somebody just said in the chat, that what was agreed with the councils and others, the final report that went to Scottish Government in June, wasn't that there'll be pilots in those 4 areas. It's that we would want to have pilots. Where they were, what sort of communities they covered, and so forth, would still to be decided. However, as somebody just put in the chat, as I said in the presentation, the barriers HMRC and EWP. We can't run it partly on grounds of cost, because we'd want to use the savings from not having the existing means tested benefits and such. That requires DWP to agree, and they haven't. And also, for the ethical reasons, we couldn't say to somebody, because you live in this area, you're going to get a basic income, and therefore we want to, you don't have to work because you're getting a basic income. That's what the definition is, and it can't be withdrawn from you. If the DWP don't agree to that, then they could sanction you if you moved house outside the area, if the experiment came to a stop at the end of the pilot period, and so on. So the real barriers aren't that there would be control groups and so on. That was always built into the methodology. That's accepted as very, very sound, rigorous way of evaluating the different sort of impacts we think might come from a basic income. The problem isn't the councils, it's the UK government departments. And until that's solved, until they move, nothing can change. And not only in Scotland, but anywhere else across the UK. Johnny?
Yeah, just to add on to that, it's an interesting situation where kind of politics in some form usually gets in the way of making progress. So we'd absolutely love to work more closely with you all on working out how we apply different pressures to push the UK government to kind of into a position that they're probably never going to want to do. But as we've seen, one of two things that they consistently do, and that is basically mess things up and get them very, very wrong, especially when there's any degree of complexity to them. And also U-turn on things that they say that they definitely won't do. So it's not about necessarily getting them to say yes, it's about pushing them until they begrudgingly go, oh, we're all right then. And one of the ways I think we can do that, and certainly support from the lab network, is that we have a really active group in Wales. We're just about to found the 6th lab in Wales and also in Northern Ireland. And we can apply positively those levers of pressure to each of the component parts of the country to keep pushing people forward to do things to potentially be first, or to just actively keep showing how progress is being made. Therefore, let's all be at the forefront of that progress, not only as the kind of individual parts of the country, but also in comparison to the rest of the world. And one of the ways that we do that is by shifting the Overton window around our elected officials, which is one of the reasons why we've started the CPPLG, so that officially recognises all elected representatives, not just as an APPG would, in terms of it only represents MPs and peers. It's anyone who's an elected representative, first of its kind. Ronnie Cowan is actually on the call, who's one of our co-chairs, and it's all about providing either a mandate, if our politicians are supportive, or pressure to shift them to do what's representative of the people that have put them in a position, to get them to campaign at all levels, locally, regionally and nationally, to do what we want them to do.
Great, thanks. Chiwi, do you want to come in at all?
Not on that, but there's a question on unions, on employers being encouraged to pay low.
Okay, we'll ask the questioner to post the question, Chiwi, if that's okay. Thanks. So I think it's Bob. Bob, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. If every person over 18, or maybe in Scotland over 16, receives UBI, how will that affect trade unions' ability to negotiate good terms and conditions for their members? Will employers be more likely to argue, you're already getting so much through UBI, and so I don't need to pay you as much?
Thanks, Bob. One thing I would probably add to that before we go to the panellists is that I do wonder if there's a little bit of a, within trade unions, a little bit of an antiquated view where all of us need to get our basic needs met through selling our labour, rather than, having them met, as a universal right, and then using our labour as we choose. But I'll pass over to the panellists, and maybe TV, you can start us off.
Yeah, I mean, it's a concern that's raised quite a lot. But I think my position on that is that, yeah, there are many good employers, but bad employers will pay as low wages as as they can get away with. If our employers paid wages based on whether they had enough to survive, we wouldn't have people who work going to food banks right now. And also, when it comes to trade unions, I think that trade unions and in order to avoid low living wage, so we need to have a living wage law, right? And strong rights and strong trade unions. We can't have those two not working together. You need both of those to work together, and so trade unions are important to that argument as well.
Oh, Johnny's coming. Yeah, if I just follow up. Firstly, 3 years ago, I was at the SGC annual Congress and they passed a composite motion supporting basic income. So certain trade unions are in favour. The ones who tend to represent the higher paid are often, again, for various reasons. As I said earlier, it should actually strengthen trade unions. Their members can walk away and say, we're not going to take jobs at these poverty wages. We've now got the power to say no, because our basic needs have been met by this income. Therefore, it undermines the employer, the poor employer, the one who pays low wages and so on. And fundamentally, at the bottom of the UK's economic crisis, which has been developing for many, many years, is poor pay, unstructured labour markets, a lack of trade union membership and collective bargaining. So we actually need to turn all these things on their head, and basic income in the current position is a way to take us forward. I think Johnny was wanting to come in.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. It's back to that kind of in the midterm fundamental shifts. If you've got the card in the pack that says, I don't have to take your job, then your employer, if they're not doing things in the right way, has less power over you. And it means that if people have more choice, you actually have to pay more to do those jobs that people might not want to do. And it fundamentally shifts power to the individual and the employee, which let's just theoretically suggest might be one of the reasons why certain people are against giving everybody a universal basic income. And the other really important thing to think about is, well, two things really. One, if we keep talking about an entrepreneurial and enterprising startup culture in this country, then we need to put people in and create the conditions that allow them to do that. So if young people, especially students, are leaving university or college or school education and they don't have any dependents and they don't have as higher overheads, then they can live in situations that allow them to actually start businesses and have a go at things. Because the only way that anyone ever gets good at anything is by having the time to spend doing that. And the brutal reality is we're all going to need that time, because no one will have a career for life. It's already happening in many industries, and it's probably universally applicable to all industries now. And we will need the means to be able to plan, to reskill and change throughout our entire careers. And we will need to constantly relearn, and we will potentially fundamentally start to see universities as a different resource, which we will go to at multiple points during our lifetimes in order to gain new skills. And you can only do that if you know that you've got a certain amount of money coming in and you can plan for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years in advance to achieve a change in your life.
Thanks. Thank you for that, Johnny. We're getting a bit short on time, but we've got a couple of people asking questions that are kind of waiting to speak. So we got Brian, and then we'll get to Ronnie. So Brian Batson, you wanted to ask a question about local economy, I think. Brian, are you around?
Right, I'm here. Right.
Thanks.
I think that's partly been answered, but my question was, is there any evidence that we can use to persuade skeptics that this is a good move, and that it will benefit the local economy, because the money will likely to be spent locally. It's not going to go off and buy yachts, is it? It's going to be spent locally and therefore benefit local economies. So what I'm looking for is evidence of that so that I can use it.
Thanks.
Very quickly, yes, there's a lot. New Earnings Foundation is a very simple tool you can apply. Technically, it's called the multiplier for those on low pay, low incomes. Effect is much higher than those who are rich. Basically, if you've got a basic income with a small or a big B, you spend that on goods and services, usually locally. That money circulates in the local economy, grows the local economy. As your question said, somebody who's rich, give them more money. What do they do with it? They squirrel it away in Panama, other tax havens, or in imported luxury goods. Some of the very basic research, coincidentally, was done in Inverclyde, in Ronnie's constituency.
Chiwi or Johnny, do you want to add to that? No. Okay.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that this is why when we're testing it, it's just really important that we look at the saturation model. So we're testing an entire community of people so that we can see some of those potential more macro effects rather than doing the potentially kind of traditional academic selected at random model. We want a group of people within an area of maybe 1,000 plus all having it so that you can actually experience the differences by walking into that community. But yeah, as you say, we're short of time, so.
Thanks, Johnny. Okay, so Ronnie Cowan, you have a question? Ronnie?
No, I didn't. I raised my hand by mistake. I'm terribly sorry.
Do you want to contribute? Because I know you're a bit of a player in this game.
I've been talking to a few folk in the chat. It's been very interesting. I'm here to listen to learn and see what people's concerns are. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any final questions from anybody? Panelists, do you want to say a last sentence, and then we'll briefly talk about our plans to hold a second meeting on the 17th, on February 17th. Panelists.
Just to say thank you for having us, and I'm really sorry I didn't have much to refer to from Glasgow, but maybe the most recent case of Mercy Baguma, who died in the house because of extreme poverty, with her child in there, is probably the most poignant reason why I think we should be advocating for universal basic income, especially in the case of people with no recourse to public funds as well, and how the COVID has impacted them in that sense. So, but thank you for having us.
Yeah, just to follow on from that, solving the issues we have as a society is going to be tough, but it's not complicated from the respect that people don't know what those problems are. And the best way to solve those problems is to have as many people as possible with that lived experience working on or in a position to be able to tackle those issues. And hopefully that's what a basic income puts people in a position to do. And once we've got a basic income for everybody, we can start looking at the real problems that we face. So the sooner the better. And we would love to work with all of you to do that, because as the favorite Margaret Mead quote goes, if we want to change the world, it is always done by a small group of dedicated individuals. So look forward to working with you and affecting some positive changes in the future.
Thanks, Johnny. Thanks for coming along. Mike, do you want to?
Yeah, from the Scottish end, as I said several times, in many ways we won the arguments in Scotland from the bottom up and the top down. I fully expected to be in the manifestos for the one or two parties who will be leading the Scottish Government come May, but they'll both be constrained for all the reasons I gave, being able to introduce. Therefore, a lot of our efforts and your own need to be focused at the Westminster Government, so our representatives in the Westminster Parliament, to get them to move and just keep arguing there. Within Scotland, we're moving on from acceptance to say, right, implementation, what would this mean? How does this sit alongside a lot of other changes, constitutional and otherwise, of the sort of Scotland we want to see in the future?
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming along. It's really great to see so many people interested, and it was really great to have Mike along, and also Chiwe and Johnny too. We, as the organising group in Commonweal Local, were really keen to take this forward and not allow it to be a one-off event. So we have provisionally booked another Zoom meeting for those interested in joining a group going forward, where we can, spread the word, speak to our friends, neighbours, colleagues, elected politicians, anybody who's here we might have just now. Sam, if you could put the email for Glasgow, it's Glasgow commonweal@gmail.com. If anyone wants to ask us further questions, please email us. We will send out a post meeting message to everyone who has registered on Eventbrite, or whose email address I have had if they've corresponded directly via email today. So please put the date in your diary for February 17th, and hopefully we will have representatives, in the first instance from BINS and from the UBI labs to kind of assist us in the way to go forward, and how to kind of, bother people that have powers to kind of have this implemented, and to who have the ears of those who make the decisions. So thank you very much. I guess that's about it, and we will be in touch, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's been brilliant, really, really good. Look forward to having more meetings soon.
Thanks very much. Thanks for organising it.
Yeah, thanks everyone for involved. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Hello. Bye-bye.